Grizzly bears, are they ready for delisting? This introductory video and corresponding lesson are brought to you thanks to the generosity of these fine folks. Are grizzly bears in the lower 48 states ready for delisting? At the end of this video, you're going to use real-world data to answer this question. First, let's get started with some background information. Grizzly bears are a subspecies of brown bears, and brown bears are one of 8 bear species worldwide. We also have polar bears, American black bears, spectacled bears, giant panda bears, sloth bears, Asiatic black bears, and sun bears. Of all 8 bear species, brown bears have the most widespread distribution. In North America, what's the story for grizzly bears? Well, let's find out. Prior to the 1800s in North America, grizzly bears ranged from Alaska to Mexico as far east as the western shores of Hudson Bay. In the lower 48 states alone, it's estimated that there were about 50,000 grizzly bears. By 1975, less than 1,000 grizzlies remained in the lower 48 states, occupying less than 2% of their historic range. The grizzlies in the lower 48 states will be the focus of this video. In 1975, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed the grizzly bear in the lower 48 as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. At that point, grizzly bears were placed under federal protection with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Now, it's important to remember that the goal of the ESA is to recover listed species to the point that federal protection is no longer needed, and management of the species can then be returned to state wildlife agencies. In 1981, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service hired Dr. Chris Servine to serve as the grizzly bear recovery coordinator. In 1982, the first grizzly bear recovery plan was completed, and in this plan they identified 6 grizzly bear recovery zones. Let's take a quick look at these recovery zones. We have the North Cascades, the Selkirks, the Cabinet Yaak, the Northern Continental Divide Ecosystem, the Bitterroot, and the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem grizzly bear recovery zones. In 1983, the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee, IGBC, was formed to help ensure the recovery of viable grizzly bear populations in those 6 grizzly bear recovery zones. The IGBC includes top-level federal, state, and Canadian representatives from these agencies. Now, the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee was formed in 1983. Let's fast forward 24 years. What happened in 2007 that affected grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem Recovery Zone? Well, thanks to the Endangered Species Act protection and a lot of work by the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee and others, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service delisted the grizzly bear population in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. Now, for some folks, this was a triumph, right? It was proof that the ESA worked. To some stakeholders, the delisting seemed like an abandonment of a grizzly bear population that still needed ESA protection. In 2009, a federal court overturned the 2007 delisting, and at that point, grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem were relisted as a threatened species. In March 2016, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposed delisting the grizzly bear population in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. So, is the grizzly bear population in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem ready for delisting? Or does it need continued ESA protection? And what about the grizzly bear populations in the other recovery zones? Did you know that grizzly bear populations in each of the 6 different recovery zones can be listed, delisted and considered recovered independently. So let's take a closer look at the 6 recovery zones again. In this grizzly bear recovery zone, the North Cascades, the number of grizzly bears is so low that this population might be uplisted from threatened to endangered status. And in these 2 grizzly bear recovery zones, the Selkirks and the Cabinet Yaak, the number of grizzly bears has increased since 1975, but not enough to even begin considering possible delisting. And in this grizzly bear recovery zone, the Bitterroot, there is currently no known grizzly bears occupying this area. So, clearly the grizzly bear populations in these 4 grizzly bear recovery zones are not ready for delisting. Okay, but what about the grizzly bear populations in these other 2 grizzly bear recovery zones, the Northern Continental Divide Ecosystem and the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem? In fact, 95% of all grizzly bears in the lower 48 states live in these 2 grizzly bear recovery zones. Well, how do we determine whether grizzly bear populations in these 2 recovery zones are ready for delisting? Well, we can look in the Grizzly Bear Recovery Plan. It provides a roadmap to recovery with science-based recovery criteria that must be met before a grizzly bear population can be considered biologically recovered. Okay, well, what are the recovery criteria and how do we measure them? Well, that's a great question. The recovery criteria are specific to each recovery zone. For this part of the video, we're going to focus on the demographic recovery criteria for the grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. And the word demographic simply refers to the grizzly bear population. So the demographic recovery criteria for the GYE grizzly bears includes, number 1, we have to maintain a minimum of 48 females with cubs in the GYE, and this number cannot fall below 48 for 2 consecutive years. The total population cannot fall below 500 for 2 consecutive years. Number 2, females with cubs must be distributed throughout the GYE. And number 3, the annual mortality rate must be sustainable so that a healthy population can be maintained. There's also 3 habitat recovery criteria for the GYE grizzly bears. You're going to learn more about habitat during the results show. For the rest of this video and for the corresponding lesson, we're going to focus on the 3 demographic recovery criteria. Let's look at this one first. We have to maintain a minimum of 48 females with cubs, and this number cannot fall below 48 for 2 consecutive years, and the total population cannot fall below 500 for 2 consecutive years. So why focus so much on female grizzly bears? The answer is because adult females are considered the most important segment of the grizzly bear population, and so ensuring that they survive and are reproductively successful is important to offset existing mortality. Okay, well, why 48? Why is that a magic number? The answer is 48 females with cubs is an index of at least 500 bears in the entire population. Okay, so why is it important to maintain at least 500 bears in the GYE grizzly bear population? Well, that's because the GYE population is geographically isolated from other bear populations. So to minimize loss of genetic diversity, scientists recommend that the number of bears in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem population needs to be equal or greater than 500. Let's look at this criterion next. Females with cubs must be distributed throughout the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. Here's a map of the GYE, and the boundary of Yellowstone National Park is marked with a red dotted line. Female grizzlies with cubs must occupy the entire Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, not just Yellowstone National Park. Okay, let's look at the last one. The annual mortality rate must be sustainable so that a healthy population can be maintained. The greatest threat to grizzly bears in the GYE is human-caused mortality. The sustainable mortality rate establishes the upper limit on the number of grizzly deaths that can occur yet still maintain a healthy population. As of April 2016, the annual sustainable mortality rates are 9% for independent females, 15% for independent males, and 9% for dependent young. Okay, we've taken a quick look at the 3 demographic criteria for the grizzly bear population in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. You might be asking this question: how do scientists know when demographic recovery criteria are met? Well, they collect data from grizzly bear populations in each of the 6 recovery zones, and then they compare those data with the recovery criteria. In the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem Recovery Zone, these data are collected by the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team. What's the distinction between IGBC and IGBST? Well, let's take a quick look. The Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee, IGBC, is a group of high-level managers charged with implementing the recovery plan for grizzly bears in all 6 recovery zones. The Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team, the IGBST, does the hands-on research, monitoring, and data analyses for the GYE grizzly bear population. And the IGBST is comprised of scientists from several organizations, including the U.S. Geological Survey, the U.S. Forest Service, and state wildlife agencies. Well, how do they collect data on grizzly bears? Well, they use a variety of field methods. For example, one way to measure the distribution of female grizzlies with cubs, which is important to evaluate criterion number 2, is to trap grizzlies, anesthetize them for handling and attach GPS collars, and then track their movements. Sometimes grizzly bear distribution is measured from aircraft. To estimate the number of females with cubs, and to estimate population size, which is important to evaluate criterion number 1, scientists use a variety of methods. One field method is to capture and recapture bears, and then use those capture-recapture data with statistical models to estimate population size and the number of females with cubs. Another way to estimate population demographics is to use DNA from hair snare field studies. DNA data can be considered capture-recapture data. This is a grizzly bear that's been lured to one of those hair snare sites. And as he steps over the barbed wire, the hope is that some of his hair and some of his DNA will get hooked onto the barbed wire. Now that you've seen how data are collected on grizzly bears, it's your turn. You're going to be using some of the real-world data collected on grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem to determine whether or not this population is biologically ready for delisting. Are you ready? Let's get started. Step 1. First, your teacher will hand out student pages and real data set to each of you. Step 2. Individually, follow the instructions in the student pages to analyze your data. Step 3. Your teacher is going to divide you into 3 science teams. Each team will be assigned one of the 3 demographic recovery criteria. Step 4. Each science team will work through their student pages designed for the group activity. Step 5. Each science team is going to present their findings to the class. And Step 6. Come back and watch the results show. Remember, when all 3 science teams have finished presenting results to the classmates, come on back and watch the results show. This concludes the introductory video for grizzly bears ready for delisting. To download the free student pages, datasets, teacher guide, and results show that accompany this video, please visit Bear Trust International's website at www.beartrust.org. Thank you.